Today I've got great questions, and the main one is on mosquitoes in the 18th century. Thanks for joining us today on Questions and Answers with James Townsend and Son. The first comment is from the Sweatable Garden. I think that's how you say it. He says, I really enjoyed these two episodes. He's talking about the garden episodes that we did, and I know I'm supposed to do an update. He says, I'm considered an expert in culinary herbs and other edibles, and I wanted to add that lavender was also used as a culinary herb. And some other commenters may have noted this. It is a frequent component of herbes de Provence. It makes a great addition to desserts like sugar cookies and cakes, and also an antibacterial agent, and was used as a sleep aid and a headache remedy. Thank you for the awesome series. Sounds like it's good for everything. Thanks for any of those kind of extra information. Thank you so much for those comments. David Kinder is commenting on the Preserving Beans episode. He says, I have a copy of The Frugal Housewife in ebook form. It's a fantastic resource for all sorts of things. Thank you so much for all the videos. Yeah, there's so many great ebooks and digital books available, and Frugal Housewife is a great one. Here's a great comment. I love this one. This is J.J. Brubs. He says, hi, I'm Jared, and I wanted to ask, how long are you going to keep this channel going? Because I think all the recipes for foods you cook in the 18th century fashion are very interesting, and I would like to try some on my own someday. The problem is I'm only 14 and I rarely go camping, so I hope this channel will continue for years to come so I can try a lot of them. They look tasty, and he wants to buy cooking stuff from the website and all this. Thank you so much, Jared, for this comment. It's great. I love the idea. We're going to keep making these videos as long as we possibly can. And you know, even at 14, and even if you don't go cooking, you can still try a lot of these things, sneak all. So you can do a lot of these things are easy and fun to do. And make sure to tune in Monday. We're not going to do a cooking episode, but we got an interview with Max Furloin, and he's 13 and he does reenacting, and I think you'll get some ideas from that. This is from Scott Garrison, and he's commenting on the brewing where we had Brewing Resources, a Q&A a few weeks back. He says, John, apologies for taking so long to get back with you on this, but I've been brewing for many years and have this book called Wines and Beers of Old New England, and it was a catalyst, apparently, for him. It's been out of print for decades, but it's recently come back, and we'll give you a link to that book so you can check it out. I don't think I've got a copy of that one yet, so I'm interested in seeing what that one's like. On the best Campfire Coffee episode, Winter's Wish Productions says, was milk and or sugar used in coffee during the time period? And if so, how did they store the milk when they weren't at home, camping, and hunting? Yes, they used milk and sugar in their coffee, and that varies really with the culture you're talking about. So here in the Americas, you're dealing with English people, you're dealing with the Dutch and other, the French. So there's a bunch of different cultures, and they each had their own way, whether coffee was popular, whether they drank it with different things. Like the Dutch didn't put sugar in their coffee, but they put the sugar in their mouth, drank the coffee through it. So each culture has got a little different tradition. As for milk on the trail, more than likely they didn't have milk on the trail. They wouldn't have brought that with them. If they did have it, they would have procured it locally. On last Monday's Campfire Dumplings, the Hasty Pudding episode, Bozo, he writes, I understand this recipe is from a wealthy woman, but just how common were lemons in the Canadian wilderness? Well, I doubt they were very common at all for people who weren't wealthy. Lemons are something that will last a little while, so I can see people, going to town every couple of months and getting, they might get a few lemons and bring them back and use them. Poorer people would have probably not used them at all, or used substitutes that would have given them a similar kind of a tangy little flavor. So you might be able to use rose hips or other kinds of tangy fruits in this, even apple, pairings or whatever. So lemons in the wilderness, Probably not much, but she made reference to it, so at least someone did. From the last Q&A on Sugar in America, Ryan Mood says, great video, always some very interesting info. I've always been curious as to whether you, he's talking about me, have had formal education, some sort of history degree, or did you just learn it on your own? Well, it's 40 years of being in James Townsend and Son and, running it or growing up in it really is where I get all my education. I read lots of books, lots of stuff online, look at lots of paintings, and so all my stuff is informal education. It's kind of hard to get a formal education in the domestic, material culture things from the 18th century. That's a pretty specific topic that's kind of hard to go to school for. Much easier to do it on your own. From the Preserving Strawberries episode, could you preserve blueberries in the same way? Well, apparently you can. Let me read you a little bit out of a book I've got here. About 10 days ago, Kevin was out talking to Peter Goebel out on the East Coast. And Peter Goebel is our coppersmith person, and he makes a lot of the great copperware that we have available in our catalog. Anyway, he was asking about resources that Peter uses, and one of the resources was this book, Peter Kalm's Travels in North America. And here's a little section out of it where he's talking about huckleberries, very similar. He may have actually meant blueberries, but he calls them huckleberries here. He says, the Europeans also collected a quantity of these berries. He earlier referenced the Indians drying the blueberries. Here he says, the Europeans have also collected a quantity of these berries to dry them in ovens and to bake them in tarts and to employ them in several other ways. Some preserve them with treacle. They likewise are eaten raw, either with or without fresh milk. And this was written in 1749. So they're right in the center of the 18th century. You've got blueberries being preserved, eaten fresh, but preserving them also by drying them. The Indians apparently dried them in the sun. The Europeans would dry them in the sun or in ovens. And they even stored them or preserved them in treacle, which is kind of very similar to that storing in the sugar idea. So here's a comment from our worst recipe ever, pickled smelt. And it's, hey, Hetty, what's cooking? That's the person. She says, I just love your channel. I love colonial cooking. I just love colonial things in general. She says, I must admit, though, I don't know that I could talk myself into trying this recipe. Well, I think you should. The interesting thing about this one is that it's not something you would eat. You have a whole bowl of these pickled smelts. It's something that you might use in a recipe to give you kind of a burst of flavor, or something that you would just eat one of at the end of your meal or in the middle of the meal to give you a kind of a perk up in flavor, or like a garnish in a salmagundi. So don't consider this something to eat all by itself, but consider it as a small part of the meal. And I think it might actually turn out better than you expect. Here's one from way back when we did the Scotch eggs recipe last summer. It's Noons 67. And he says, instead of using pork, can we use beef instead? I think beef would make a great substitute for the pork in this particular recipe. It probably doesn't make any difference at all. Be just as good. And here are the main questions. There's a couple of them here. Here's M. Todd and Over the Moon. He says, M. Todd says, I love your videos. You mentioned mosquitoes a few times. Were there any ways of keeping them away in the 1800s? And also Over the Moon says, you mentioned mosquitoes a couple of times. How did they deal with mosquitoes in the 18th century? Well, let me go back to Peter Kalm's book. He's got several sections where he talks about mosquitoes. Let me read you a little piece out of that. So he actually mentions 3 different pestilential insects. He mentions mosquitoes, gnats, which I think he means what we might call no-see-ums. I'm not sure what you might call them. And he calls another one he talks about are woodlice, which he probably means ticks, like dog ticks or deer ticks. Anyway, he says here in this section, he says, the vast woods and uninhabited grounds between Albany and Canada contain immense swarms of gnats, which annoy the travelers. To be in some measure secured against these insects, some besmear their faces with butter or grease, so the gnats do not like to settle on greasy places. The great heat makes boots uncomfortable, but to prevent the gnats from stinging the legs, they wrap some paper around them under their stockings. So inside their stockings, they would stuff sheets of paper so that the mosquitoes couldn't bite through them. Some travelers wear caps which cover their whole face, and some have gauze over the eyes. And at night, they lie in tents if they can carry any with them, and make a great fire at the entrance so that the smoke will drive the pests away. So they had several different methods similar to what we might use. I don't know about putting butter on my face, but putting things on their face. They used the paper. They wore something like gauze over their head, like mosquito netting that we might use, which I have to, if I go out at home right now, I have to put a net over my head or else they're just clouds of them. Or smoke to drive them away. And there are many references to mosquitoes in here. This is the only section where he actually talks about what people do to try to keep them away, except that occasionally he mentions this smoke thing in a couple of different places, that even people wouldn't be able to sleep even in their homes, and they would have to light big smoky fires just to keep the mosquitoes away. So it was amazing to read how many times. If Private Yankee Doodle is a book and he complains about the food all the time, this one's pretty much a book complaining about the mosquitoes all the time. So mosquitoes were definitely as much an issue back then or more than they are today. I really want to thank everyone for your amazing comments and your very, very kind compliments toward what we do. That encouragement is it's essential for us to keep doing. It's a lot of work, but I love the comments, and it really energizes us and keeps us going. Thank you for your great questions. And I really want to thank everyone for the kind of support that you guys do, sharing our videos on Facebook or on YouTube. That is very, very kind. Thank you guys so much for sharing our information, and I really want to thank you for watching. If you're a new viewer and you haven't subscribed, press the subscribe button up here. That'll take you to a spot where you can subscribe. That really is the best way to get notification of all the new videos that are out. I want to thank everyone for watching.